Hello, my name is Pat Fagan. I'm director of the Marriage and Religion Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And today we're going to talk about the impact of religious worship on things human. One of the areas that was not investigated much, there's always been a little sociological study of religion, but in the last 2 decades there's been a massive rise in it, occasioned by a number of the federal surveys, U.S. federal surveys, gathering data points on the frequency of religious worship and also on the importance of religion to people in their lives. And one of the amazing outcomes, when I first stumbled across this area, working with Dave Larson, Dr. Dave Larson, who was an adjunct professor at Duke Medical School here, he was one of the senior research fellows at NIH on cardiovascular and psychiatric issues. And he first began exploring the medical aspects and the medical correlates of religious worship and found that they were actually quite powerful. Triggered by that, I began looking at many, many other areas and commissioned a certain amount of research by other contractors, investigating the federal surveys and looking at the correlates between frequency of religious worship and outcomes. And after a while, a pattern emerged. It's almost boring. You can predict with almost every single outcome. If it's a positive one, the more people worship, the higher they're going to be on that outcome. For instance, grade point average for American seniors or American high school students. If you take a combination of math and English, which is a good overall score, nationally, those who worship weekly score the highest. Those who worship a couple of times a month, one notch down. A couple of times a year, and never. It's directly linear. And on all the positive outcomes, you get that sort of relationship. Sometimes the slope is less, but it's always in that positive direction, that the more worship, the greater the outcome. On the negative outcomes, you get the opposite, that those who worship weekly, or more frequently even than weekly, are the ones least likely to suffer or to engage in bad stuff. Those who worship a couple of times a month, slightly higher, a couple of times a year, and never. Though occasionally on the negatives, the highest is the second last. And the first that I stumbled across, that was an interesting, almost humorous one. It was Dave Larson pointed it out, that those who fear death the most, the anxiety about death, which is a negative, actually those who have the highest fear of death are not those who never worship God, but those who worship Him a couple of times a year. But coming to the general point, that the worship of God, just from the sociological data, is clearly good for men. And in our day, when we have much debate on matters of religious freedom, it is a foolish nation that doesn't cultivate the worship of God among its people, with religious freedom, of course. The more worship there is among the populace, the greater the benefits are going to be in all the major institutions, in government, in the marketplace, in education, in the family, and of course in religion itself. Again, illustrating that the social sciences, well done, cannot but illustrate the way God made man.